The battlefield was a furnace of smoke, blood, and shattered earth. Explosions tore through the air while stretcher-bearers darted between craters, hauling the wounded from mud that swallowed boots and bodies alike. Among the chaos, German soldiers, once proud on the march, now lay broken on the ground. Some clutched shattered limbs, others cried out for water, and many braced for neglect or worse. They had been told that capture by Americans meant cruelty, that the enemy had no mercy. Yet when the battle moved past them and the tide of fighting rolled forward, something unexpected occurred. Instead of being abandoned in the dirt, the wounded were lifted onto stretchers and carried into tents marked with a red cross. Inside, the air was thick with disinfectant, the light harsh against steel instruments laid out in perfect order. Hands worked quickly, cutting away uniforms, washing wounds, and stitching torn flesh with precision. The same men who had faced American rifles in the morning now found themselves under American care by nightfall. It felt unreal. In Germany's own hospitals, patients often lay crammed into hallways, bandages scarce, medicine rationed to the point of cruelty. But here, in the enemy's ward, clean beds and plentiful supplies seemed endless. Sulfa powder dusted over wounds, morphine dulled pain, and bandages were wrapped with care instead of torn cloth. Whispers rippled through the rows of stretchers, this was better than what many had seen in Nazi hospitals. Rumors spread quickly, as they always did. Some insisted it was all an experiment, that the Americans were testing new drugs on them. Others claimed they had glimpsed machines that could see through skin and bone, proof, they said, that the U.S. Army was already using MRI scans in 1944. Few understood what such words even meant, but the rumor grew anyway. Suspicion clung to every act of kindness. Still, wounds that should have festered began to heal. Fevers broke. Infections eased. Men who had expected death within days found themselves alive, breathing, recovering. The very thing they feared most, that the enemy would show no humanity, was being disproved before their eyes. Lying in rows beneath canvas roofs, they listened to the steady rhythm of scissors, the quiet voices of nurses, the scrape of boots as doctors moved swiftly from bed to bed. The reality was impossible to ignore. The enemy not only captured them, but treated them with more care than many had ever known at home. And as the days passed, the realization sank in like a wound of its own. They had fought, bled, and lost for a regime that had preached sacrifice above all. Yet it was the enemy, the Americans, who stitched them back together. If you think loyalty survives easily under such circumstances, think again. Survival changes everything. And for these men, the first cut of doubt did not come from a bullet, it came from a scalpel in a tent where the enemy chose to heal instead of kill. The first days in the American wards blurred together in a haze of shock. The prisoners had expected pain and indifference, perhaps a slow death left unattended. Instead, they awoke to clean sheets beneath them and trays of medicine placed carefully on tables. The contrast was almost unbearable. In the Reich's hospitals, the wounded had often lain in overcrowded corridors, waiting for hours with nothing but dirty water to clean their wounds. Here, antiseptics stung their cuts, sulfa powder hissed against infected flesh, and bandages were replaced before the smell of rot could take hold. The discovery spread slowly, almost unwillingly. Each time a wound was dressed, each time fever broke under the calm hands of nurses, disbelief deepened. For men taught that Americans were brutes, the sight of enemy doctors working with care felt like betrayal of everything they had believed. Some whispered that it was all a trick, that the kindness was a mask hiding something sinister. Yet the evidence lay on their own bodies, stitches held, infections faded, broken bones were set straight with skill. What stunned them most was the availability of treatments they had never seen in Germany. Penicillin, still scarce and precious in Europe, appeared here as though drawn from endless supplies. In the wards, infections that once meant amputation now healed within days. Prisoners exchanged hushed words, "This is not possible, not even in Berlin." A few went further, insisting that penicillin was not new at all, that it had been invented during the Roman Empire and rediscovered by America. The mistake lingered, repeated so often that some began to accept it as truth. Even the surroundings seemed designed to unsettle them. The wards were orderly, the air smelled of soap rather than sweat, and meals were carried in on schedule. Fresh fruit, broth, even small squares of chocolate appeared at times, offered without fanfare. Compared to the lice-ridden bunks of field hospitals back home, the difference was staggering. Some prisoners stared at their trays as if expecting them to vanish, convinced that such care could not be meant for enemies. The psychological weight pressed heavily. To be treated as human by those they had been told were monsters broke something inside them. At night, the barracks echoed not only with groans of the wounded but with murmurs of unease. Was this real compassion, or was it a weapon more dangerous than bullets? A few hardened men tried to resist, refusing medicine or spitting out broth in defiance. But when fever raged or pain returned, even they yielded. No ideology can numb a shattered bone set wrong. The Americans did not preach, they did not argue. They simply healed. And in that silence, doubt crept into the minds of the captives. If the Reich had demanded sacrifice, why did it so often deny even the most basic care? And why did the enemy give so freely what their own leaders withheld? It was here, in the rows of clean beds and under the glow of electric lamps, that the first comparisons formed. They spoke in whispers of German hospitals where patients lay 3 to a bed, where medicine was stolen by black marketeers, where only officers received proper care. In America, even ordinary soldiers, their prisoners, were tended with professionalism that outstripped the Reich's most celebrated wards. For men who had once believed themselves part of a master race, the humiliation cut deep. But humiliation was not the only feeling. Gratitude grew alongside it, an uneasy gratitude that gnawed at loyalty. Some prisoners hid it, refusing to admit that their view of the enemy was changing. Others allowed it to take root, silently acknowledging that survival mattered more than propaganda. And you, listening now, may think this is exaggeration, that no enemy could ever treat prisoners better than their own side. But history is rarely comfortable. Mercy, in this case, became a sharper weapon than cruelty. And if you doubt it, consider this: these men, defeated and broken, found themselves lying in wards that in many cases outshone the hospitals of Berlin itself. That truth alone is enough to unsettle even the proudest memory of war. The wards were not quiet sanctuaries but busy hives, filled with the constant shuffle of boots, the murmur of voices, and the clink of instruments against metal trays. Prisoners realized quickly that they were not alone. In cots only steps away lay wounded Americans, some groaning softly, others staring blankly at the ceiling. Curtains hung between beds, but sound carried through. The same nurses moved from one side to the other, adjusting bandages, checking pulses, offering water. For the prisoners, it was disorienting. The war outside raged without mercy, but inside these canvas walls, enemies breathed the same air and received the same care. It was more than medicine, it was a kind of equality they had never seen. In their own system, treatment had always been distributed by rank and privilege. Officers received proper attention, while common soldiers often waited until their wounds festered. Here, the difference was erased. A private in gray was stitched with the same thread as a sergeant in olive drab. The sight unsettled them more than open hostility ever could. Conversations carried through the partitions. A wounded American whispered to his comrade about baseball games in New York, while a German 2 cots away lay listening in silence, unable to comprehend how casually life beyond the war was discussed. The sound of laughter, light and unforced, struck harder than any interrogation. For men taught that Americans were decadent brutes, the normalcy of those voices was the deepest contradiction. Among the most startling discoveries was the presence of women in the wards. Nurses in crisp uniforms moved with efficiency, unflinching before wounds that made soldiers turn away. Some prisoners stared in disbelief. Back home, women had been confined mostly to auxiliary roles. Here, they worked shoulder to shoulder with doctors, commanding the space with quiet authority. One rumor spread quickly, that women had not been allowed to practice medicine anywhere until the 1970s, and that what they were witnessing was something impossibly ahead of its time. The mistake lingered in whispered conversations, a sign of how far the reality clashed with their assumptions. What unsettled them even more was the absence of propaganda. No speeches were delivered, no leaflets were pressed into their hands. The Americans did not tell them what to think, they simply treated their wounds. That silence forced the prisoners to draw their own comparisons, and those comparisons gnawed at them. If the Reich had demanded sacrifice but given little in return, why did the enemy offer care without condition? The effect was not immediate, but it was steady. Prisoners began to notice how quickly infections receded, how steadily broken bones were set, how the fevers that should have taken lives instead broke within days. They also noticed the casual way it all unfolded, as if healing the enemy were not extraordinary at all, but simply routine. That very normalcy was what made it unbearable. If cruelty could be dismissed as propaganda, kindness could not. At night, the wards became places of restless reflection. Men lay awake, listening to the faint beeping of monitors, the drip of water into basins, the occasional cough from an American soldier behind the curtain. Some clenched their jaws in defiance, determined not to let gratitude erode loyalty. Others closed their eyes and let the strange comfort wash over them, even as shame pressed down like another weight on their chests. They had come to expect cages and cruelty. Instead, they found a system that seemed to erase the lines they had been taught were unbreakable. And in that erasure lay the deepest wound of all. For anyone listening now, it might be tempting to dismiss this as exaggeration, to imagine that the enemy simply exaggerated their treatment. But ask yourself, why do so many survivors recall not only the fences and the guards, but also the shock of lying in wards where mercy replaced hatred? If history were simple, there would be no such contradictions. Yet here it was, enemies cared for as equals, and loyalty tested not by pain, but by compassion. The more time passed, the more obvious it became that American generosity was not random. The steady rhythm of clean dressings, warm meals, and medicine on schedule carried with it an unspoken message: survival here was not a privilege, it was policy. The prisoners began to understand that care itself was being used as a weapon, one far subtler than bullets or barbed wire. For years, they had been told that strength came from sacrifice. In the Reich, the sick were hidden away, the wounded were treated when resources allowed, and the weak were spoken of as burdens. Yet here, the enemy seemed to build strength out of something else entirely. Healing was not weakness, it was control. A prisoner whose fever breaks quickly will not riot. A man with his wounds stitched will not lash out in desperation. Mercy kept the camps quiet, and quiet camps needed fewer guards. The strategy unfolded in silence. No lectures, no threats. The simple act of being treated well did the work. Every clean bandage reminded them that America could afford to give even its enemies more than Germany often gave its own. Every full plate of food after surgery whispered that this country had abundance to spare. Each time morphine dulled their pain, the unspoken question returned: if the enemy can care for us like this, what does it say about the leaders we once followed? Some prisoners resisted the thought, clinging to loyalty like a drowning man clutching driftwood. They muttered that the Americans were trying to brainwash them. A few even tried to refuse treatment, insisting that to accept medicine was to betray their cause. But in time, pain broke down defiance. When infection clawed at the body or bones refused to set, even the most stubborn soldier allowed the enemy's doctors to work. Survival was a stronger instinct than ideology. Among the barracks, arguments flared. There were those who said the Americans meant to turn them into tools, softened by kindness until they could be used. Others countered that the very lack of propaganda proved otherwise. If this was manipulation, it was unlike anything they had been taught to expect. The debate stretched long into the night, until exhaustion silenced the words and left only doubt. Rumors added fuel to the fire. One claim, repeated until it sounded like fact, was that Hitler had once banned aspirin in Germany because it was considered an American drug. Men scoffed, some swore it was true, others laughed at the absurdity. But the rumor stuck, gnawing at their certainty. If their own leaders denied them even the simplest remedies, was it any wonder the enemy's care felt like a revelation? The Americans themselves said little. They moved with the calmness of routine, their silence almost more unnerving than speeches would have been. If they had crowed about their superiority, it would have been easy to resist. But the absence of boasting left prisoners with no defense against the evidence of their own recovery. Slowly, the truth became undeniable. The strategy of healing was not only to keep men alive, it was to make them compare. Every bandage became a mirror reflecting the failures of the system they once fought for. And in those mirrors, loyalty began to crack. For those who hear this now and believe loyalty is unshakable, ask yourself, what would you do if the enemy treated you better than your own leaders ever had? Many men thought they knew the answer before capture. But inside those wards, it was not pain that tested them, it was compassion. And compassion proved far more dangerous to conviction than cruelty ever could. The wards had begun as places of relief, but as weeks passed, they became battlegrounds of a different kind. Not with rifles or grenades, but with words, stares, and the heavy silence of suspicion. On one side were those who quietly accepted the care, who allowed their wounds to knit and their strength to return. On the other side were the loyalists, men who still clung fiercely to the Reich, who whispered that every drop of medicine was poison for the mind. The clash was invisible yet constant, each group watching the other as if betrayal could be spotted in a single glance. Small incidents grew into storms. A man who praised the efficiency of American doctors found his blanket stolen in the night. Another who admitted relief that his infection had healed woke to find his cot overturned. The ward that had once echoed with groans of recovery now vibrated with muttered warnings and the sharp hiss of arguments breaking out between rows of beds. Rumors made everything worse. Some claimed that prisoners were deliberately injuring themselves, small cuts, burns, sprains, just to gain another stay in the medical tents where food was warmer and beds were softer. Others accused the Americans of selecting which Germans to heal, keeping the strongest alive for labor while letting the weakest fade away. Neither story could be proved, but both spread like fire. The most explosive rumor came after a body was carried out of the ward under a white sheet. Officially, it was an accident, a fall from a work detail. But whispers twisted the tale. Some insisted the man had tried to kill himself to escape captivity. Others swore he had been murdered by fellow prisoners for showing too much gratitude to the enemy. The truth was swallowed by speculation, but the effect was the same. Distrust thickened until even the sound of footsteps in the ward made men tense. The Americans kept their silence, continuing their routines as though nothing had changed. Bandages were changed, meals delivered, medicines handed out. But the prisoners could not ignore the rift widening among themselves. A healed wound on the body meant little when loyalty itself was tearing apart at the seams. What shocked many was how far the arguments went. Some officers stood at the ends of beds, lecturing the wounded that by accepting treatment, they had already betrayed the Reich. Others argued back, pointing to the reality before them. "Look at us," they whispered. "We live because of this. Do you think Berlin would care for us the same?" The debates rarely ended in agreement, only in exhaustion. Amid this tension, another mistake of belief took root. Prisoners began claiming that X-ray machines had been invented in American POW camps, used first not for civilians but for enemies. The claim was absurd, but it spread quickly. The glow of lamps and the strange hum of machines they didn't understand gave the rumor strength. For men trapped between fear and survival, even impossibilities became believable. The ward was no longer just a place of healing, it was a test of loyalty. To lie still while nurses tended wounds felt, to some, like surrender. To others, it felt like the only path to life beyond the wire. Each side watched the other, convinced that the war was still being fought, only now with bandages instead of bullets. And here lies the unsettling truth. War does not end when guns fall silent, it shifts form. For these prisoners, the real battle was no longer against the enemy outside the fence, but against doubt inside their own ranks. Suspicion gnawed at them more savagely than hunger ever had. Think about it, would you call it betrayal to let the enemy heal your wounds? Or would you call it survival? The answer is simple only if you have never lived behind barbed wire. If you have, then you know how quickly right and wrong blur when the choice is between pain and relief. And if you keep listening, you'll see how those blurred lines led to consequences the men could never take back. By the spring of 1945, the wards no longer felt like sanctuaries. They had become crossroads, places where men either clung to loyalty or quietly surrendered to the strange comfort of enemy care. It was in this fragile space that one of the boldest and most reckless plots of captivity was born. The idea moved in whispers, escape disguised as a medical transfer. The Americans often moved their patients between camps, sending the most severe cases to better-equipped hospitals further inland. For weeks, prisoners had watched the trucks roll out, canvas-covered, guards distracted by paperwork and stretchers. To some, it looked less like transport and more like opportunity. The plan was simple in theory, impossible in practice. Fake injuries would provide a cover. A handful of men would smuggle themselves onto the next transport, slipping away during the journey, vanishing into the countryside where they believed sympathetic communities might hide them. It was desperation disguised as courage. Rumors spread quickly, but trust was scarce. Each man had to decide where he stood. To join meant risk of death if discovered. To remain meant living with the knowledge that others had dared while he had stayed behind. Suspicion sharpened. Even in silence, eyes flicked across cots, searching for signs of who might try. The day came when the plan moved into action. A group of prisoners, bandaged more heavily than their wounds required, waited for stretchers. Their bodies trembled not from pain but from fear. The truck idled outside, its engine grumbling in the cool morning air. The guards called names, checked lists, moved slowly through the process that had once seemed routine. But something was different. An officer lingered longer than usual, flipping through papers, frowning at details. The atmosphere shifted. Prisoners lying in the ward felt it immediately. The air grew heavy, silence pressing against the walls. And then, boots thundered, orders barked, rifles raised. The plot was discovered before it began. No one knew who had revealed it. Some whispered it was betrayal, that one of their own had broken under pressure or fear. Others insisted the Americans had known all along, their silence allowing the plan to unfold until the last moment, just to prove control. The truth was never clear. What followed was chaos. Prisoners were dragged from their stretchers, shouting that they had been framed. Guards stormed the ward, overturning bunks, searching for hidden notes or tools. Those uninvolved watched in tense silence, fear gnawing at them as much as relief. The punishment was swift. The accused were isolated, their privileges stripped, their wounds treated under tighter watch. Yet even then, the Americans did not starve them or deny them medicine. They were contained, not destroyed. For many watching, that fact was almost harder to accept than the failure of the plan itself. In the barracks that night, anger simmered. Some cursed the would-be escapees for endangering them all. Others admired the attempt, saying it was proof that not every man had been broken by comfort. And then there were those who quietly asked whether survival mattered more than loyalty. For them, the failed escape was not a shame but a warning. Captivity was safer than freedom in a foreign land. The division deepened. The act of plotting had created wounds no bandage could heal. Trust, already thin, now tore apart. Every cough, every glance, every rumor carried the weight of suspicion. The real war was no longer fought against the guards or the fences, it was fought inside the minds of the men themselves. And amid that turmoil, another strange belief took root. Some prisoners began claiming that one of the escapees had been secretly taken not to isolation but to the famous Mayo Clinic, where he was treated in the same halls as President Roosevelt himself. The rumor was absurd, impossible to confirm, yet it spread with the same urgency as truth. For men locked behind wire, even fantasy carried the power of belief. The failed escape became legend within the camp, a tale retold with bitterness and awe. Some insisted betrayal had doomed it. Others claimed it was always doomed, a fantasy born of desperation. What all agreed on was that nothing felt the same afterward. The wards that had once been places of healing were now haunted by mistrust. And here lies the darker truth: captivity does not break men through hunger or wounds alone. It breaks them by forcing choices where every option feels like betrayal. To accept medicine was to betray loyalty. To refuse it was to betray survival. To attempt escape was to betray safety. To stay behind was to betray courage. Every path led to doubt. So think carefully, what would you have done? Would you have risked everything for a chance at freedom, or stayed where the enemy healed you better than your own country ever did? Don't answer too quickly. History is full of men who thought they knew until the moment came, and in that moment, they learned how heavy survival truly feels. When the guns at last fell silent in Europe, the news reached the camps like a thunderclap. The war that had swallowed everything, cities, families, comrades, was over. For the prisoners, it should have meant relief, but the end brought its own torment. What would happen now? Repatriation was promised. Ships would carry them back across the Atlantic, into a homeland reduced to rubble. Some longed for it, aching to see families they had not heard from in years. Others dreaded it, fearing Soviet capture, political trials, or the emptiness of returning to ruins. And still others began to whisper that perhaps life in America, even as a prisoner, offered more hope than freedom in a broken Reich. The memory that weighed heaviest on them was not the fences or the guards, it was the wards. Those clean beds, steady hands, and endless supplies lingered like ghosts. They had been healed better in captivity than they ever were in their own hospitals. The thought carried shame but also wonder. If an enemy treated them so well, what did that say about the leaders they had once followed? Letters sent home in the years after release often carried fragments of this truth. Men wrote cautiously about being fed, clothed, and even healed by Americans. Some admitted outright that their lives had been saved not by comrades, but by those they had been ordered to kill. Families read these words with disbelief, torn between relief and suspicion. Could it really be that the enemy had shown more mercy than their own government? Historians later noted that many former prisoners chose medical careers after the war, inspired by what they had seen in those wards. The efficiency, the cleanliness, the simple dignity of being treated as a patient rather than as a tool of war had left a mark. Some carried those lessons into hospitals across Germany in the decades that followed. In ways subtle but undeniable, American medical care reshaped not only lives but systems. And yet, rumors persisted, rumors that blurred fact and fiction. Some claimed a handful of POWs never went home, slipping quietly into small-town America, working on farms near the very hospitals that had healed them. Others went further, insisting the war itself had not truly ended in 1945, but in 1948, when secret agreements were finally signed. Such mistakes lingered in memory, repeated in whispers until they hardened into half-believed truths. The legacy of healing was paradoxical. For some, it weakened loyalty, sowing doubt about the Reich. For others, it hardened resentment, the humiliation of being cared for by the enemy twisting into bitterness. But for most, it carved an unforgettable contradiction: captivity that brought not only survival, but life extended in ways they had never expected. Time eroded the barbed wire and dismantled the towers, but memories of those wards endured. Decades later, when former prisoners spoke, it was not always of battles fought or marches endured. More often, they recalled the shock of lying in clean sheets, of wounds closing under foreign hands, of realizing that the enemy had shown them a kind of humanity they did not expect to survive. Think of it, men who had been taught to see Americans as brutes carried into old age the memory of being healed by them. That memory shaped their stories, their families, even their children's understanding of war. And perhaps that is the deepest irony of all, what they remembered most about captivity was not cruelty, but care. For you hearing this now, it may be tempting to dismiss these accounts as anomalies, exceptions to a harsher rule. But history is made not only in battles and treaties. It is made in the quiet contradictions that refuse to fade. Healing, in those wards, became as powerful as any weapon. It disarmed men not by breaking their bodies, but by mending them. So ask yourself, if mercy can change the memory of a war, what does that say about the wars still fought today? Think carefully before you answer, because too many people prefer simple tales of heroes and villains. The truth is harder. The truth is that sometimes the sharpest wound of all is being saved by the hands you were raised to hate.